Okay, I see people logging on. Welcome everybody to the new 2021 Tuesday Talks. We're so happy that you're joining us. I see lots of people logging in right now, so we'll just wait a couple minutes just to make sure we have most of the people on. And I know some of you are tuning in on Weibo and YouTube, and so hello as well. I am so honored today to have a special guest to kick off Tuesday Talks for us. And I will let him introduce himself. But Jeff Selingo is here, and many of you have already read his newest book. And we're going to talk a little bit about this today, but we're also going to just talk about generally what Jeff's been hearing and seeing in the admissions space. And so just before we kind of dive in, I do want to encourage everybody, we do have the chat box for translation. So if you need Chinese support, I have wonderful colleagues online with me who are going to be typing as fast as they can to get you some of this rich information in your language. And we also have a Q&A box. I will be asking questions, but feel free to type in the Q&A box right away if you have some questions so that we can try to fold it into our conversation. So yeah, and for those of you who are joining us for Tuesday Talks for the first time, this is just the beginning of a great series. We're going to be talking to a lot of admissions officers, both about their institutions, but also a little bit about the trends that are happening in this space. So look forward to that. Today's Tuesday Talk is brought to you by A Single Yellow Rose. If you are a senior and you're being put on a wait list, some of you have already been put on a wait list. I'd encourage you to go take a look at this, and we will tell you more in weeks to come. So without further ado, Jeff, why don't you briefly introduce yourself, and then we will dive into asking questions.
Great. It's first of all, it's fantastic to be here with you this morning or today, and I'm just really excited for the conversation ahead. So I've been writing about colleges and universities in the U.S., but also around the world for more than 20 years. I used to be editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, which covers colleges and universities worldwide. I've written now 3 books. Who Gets In and Why, my third book, and for that book, I spent a year inside the college admissions process. So I sat with admissions officers as they read applications, as they sat in committees and voted up or down whether somebody should get in. That included at the University of Washington in Seattle, at Emory University in Atlanta, and at Davidson College in North Carolina. And so the book really takes applicants through the typical process, but also shows all the other players involved in the admissions process, from the rankings to the marketing agencies and others. And so it's really a deep dive into that process, which I know we'll be getting into a bit today.
Yeah, wonderful. And where does this find you right now?
I'm sorry, what's that?
And just what part of the world?
I'm sorry. I am in Washington, D.C., where I've been kind of homebound for now about a year. It's been a little over a year since I was actually on a plane to go somewhere. So I'm itching to get out and visit with the applicants and students and counselors and college admissions officers who really made this book possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to spend some time with us. We've got people from all over the world logging in. So it is evening for many people, but also very early morning for some others. So, so thank you for taking the time this morning. Well, so let's talk about the book. Let's just dive right in and talk about the book. What was it like trying to get kind of that opportunity, to sit in the admissions office? Like, what did you have to do to kind of get them to agree for you to kind of sit there? and how long did you sit there for?
Yeah, so I thought it was actually going to be a little easier than I thought, to be honest with you. There was a book that came out about 20 years ago called The Gatekeepers, which was written by Jack Steinberg, who was a reporter at the New York Times at the time. And in fact, the book started out as a series in the New York Times. And it was about a year in the life of admissions at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And so one of the reasons for doing this book was that was 20 years ago. The admissions process is actually very different today, and I wanted to get inside the process. But as I started approaching schools, even though they say they want transparency, even though they say they want applicants to know more about the process, they were very hesitant to let me in. At the time, Harvard was being sued around affirmative action here in the US. There was a lot of concern about what I would see and when I would see it and how I would interpret it. Even though, again, as I mentioned earlier, I've been writing about higher ed. I was not somebody just coming off the street wanting to do this. I had built up a reputation in higher education for more than 20 years at the time. But eventually I landed on these three schools. So I approached 24 colleges, and these were the three that said yes: Davidson, Emory, and University of Washington. And I think largely they said yes because they had longtime deans of admissions at all three places who were pretty confident in their process. There was one, so I got to go whenever I wanted to. Now, obviously, I'm one person and I can't be in three places at the same time, at least not yet. We haven't created that. So I was limited by the ability to travel to these places. But I was there essentially the entire season of 18 and 19. So late 2018. Early 2019, that cycle of admissions. And I was allowed to go whenever I wanted to. So I'd usually go days at a time to each of these places. And the only limitation besides the geography piece of it that I mentioned was that I couldn't talk about individual applicants by name. I could describe their situations as I do in the book, but I couldn't identify them by name. But otherwise, I was wherever I wanted to go, whatever I wanted to do, I was allowed to do it.
Great. Were there ever, like admissions officers who are kind of like, why are you here? And what, and I don't, or were you more kind of like a fly on the wall, or were you actually asking a lot of questions?
No, I was more of a fly on the wall. I mean, different admissions officers were approached this differently. I think when I first walked in the room at first, there was a little hesitation, like, why are you here? My goal wasn't to change the way they did their work. So at Emory, for example, they do the first read of applications in pairs, two people talking to each other.
Yeah.
While Davidson, a small liberal arts college, they're reading in a solo way, right? They're reading individually as they do at the University of Washington. So that's more difficult because they're reading an application and normally they wouldn't talk out loud to somebody or things like that. Where in the paired reading they did. And so that actually made it easy because I was literally in those cases a fly on the wall. So Emory actually takes probably a slightly larger part of the book as a result, because again, that was a place where I didn't have to change their process. But within probably like 10 or 20 minutes, they didn't even notice I was there. We would take breaks, and during those breaks, that's when I would ask questions about specific things. But it is like I describe describe it in the book, like they have their own menu, right? Like Diet Coke and Oreos and other things like that. They also have their own language. There's a ton of words and acronyms and things like that you're constantly like furiously writing down.
Yeah.
You're trying to figure out like, oh my God, what does that mean? And so eventually you get to obviously understand their process. But it is like its own little world in so many ways. And I felt like I was honored in some ways to kind of come into it for a little bit.
Great. So a lot of us attending this Tuesday talk have some understanding of, what the U.S. admissions world calls holistic review. But I'd like to know a little bit about, as you're sitting in the, these admissions offices, like, can you describe a little bit about the pressures that you felt like admissions offices might be feeling that would impact what we consider holistic review?
Well, so they're constantly, the word context comes up constantly in admissions, because what they're trying to do is they're reviewing the student, the applicant, on his or her own. Then they're also reviewing that same applicant in the context of the school and the opportunities and their home, right? The opportunities that they had in their life. And then finally, they are reviewing the student in the context of the entire class that they hope to create. And so essentially they're looking at students or applicants in three different ways that, by the way, could render a different decision based on what they need. So the student could be, and I always remind applicants of that, the student on the surface could be incredibly strong, have done everything right, but maybe within their school they had more opportunities and they didn't take advantage of them, right? Or that they came from an incredibly privileged background and they didn't take advantage of everything available to them. So that's the context, what I call the local context. But even if they did all that right, and this is probably the most important part, there's the context of the class. And what do I mean by that? They want geographic balance, right? They want gender balance. They want balance by majors, right? They don't want all STEM majors and things like that. So that's the balance that they're looking for at the end of the day. And in that context, you could be bringing to the table something that's very different and very unusual, or you could be bringing to the table something everybody else has. And in that case, even though you're strong individually, you're strong within your school or your community, you just may be like too many other applicants that particular year, and you get denied for that reason.
Mm-hmm. We talked about transparency a little bit earlier. These institutional goals, like how transparent are they? And and do they change? Like, you were there 18, 19, are they different, based on like what you did, years ago? And then, if you were to imagine kind of now, how does one kind of understand institutional goals?
Yeah, I'm laughing at that because this is a question I get all the time, because I always talk about how colleges and universities have goals, and the admissions office is there to fulfill them. And those goals could be we want more students from China or North Dakota or Florida or Venezuela or whatever it might be, or we want more engineering majors, or we want more men, or we want whatever it might be in a particular year. We want more full pay students. But there's no list anywhere. And I laughed because that's what I get all the time. Like, it's interesting to me that colleges and universities want students to be transparent with them. Like, they want to know what are the intentions of the student. Yeah. But when you flip it around, it's kind of a black box. It's hard to see inside the admissions office like I did. So no, there is no place where they list these priorities. They do change from year to year. So in the age of COVID, I think a couple of things are going to be higher priority. One is going to be more full pay students, or students who could pay more of the bill, right? Because obviously the global economy has been impacted by the coronavirus. And as a result, they're going to be looking for students who could pay more of the bill, because that could help out for the students they really want who can't afford it, right? So they like to balance that out. The other thing that I think is going to be happening, particularly this year, maybe even next year, is they're going to lean in, or they're going to favor, and I use that word loosely, favor, but they're going to really look favorably on students from places that they know, schools, communities, counselors, right? Without the usual pieces of the application that might not be with the application, test scores. Maybe high schools were interrupted by the pandemic. Like, different things happened where you're not getting a complete application. And in the absence of information, they're going to look for familiarity. They're going to look for counselors that have always sent them good students, schools that have always sent them good students, regions of the world or regions of the country that have always sent them good students. So I think that is a priority this year, and probably next year. They're going to be taking fewer risks on students, particularly the most selective colleges out there.
Right. Interesting. Well, I want to come back to some of that in a minute, but before we do, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the buyers and sellers kind of concept that you talk about in your book. So briefly, because I want people to actually read your book. Yep. And also, I know you have great resources as well, but if you could kind of talk a little bit about what that means, what buyers and sellers means. And I do have a slide here that has a diagram here. And
yep. And you can go to my website. So essentially this, when we think about colleges and universities, we need to think about the financial fit of colleges and universities as well. There are very few schools that give out aid there's very few schools that meet everybody's financial need. And there are schools like the sellers are essentially the most selective colleges and universities that focus most of their aid on need-based aid, on financial needs. So if you need aid, both, by the way, domestic and international students, they're going to get a sense of what you really need, and they're going to provide that. But they don't give out much money beyond that. In other words, if they feel like you can afford it, they are a seller in that their name brand is known around the world. They have way many more applicants than they know what to do with. And so as a result, they have something to sell. Again, there are about 50 or 60 of these, and almost all of their aid is focused on need-based aid. And why is this important to applicants? Because if you may not qualify for financial need, you have financial need, but maybe not enough of it. Actually, it's better to be looking at some of the buyers on my list. So the buyers are the vast majority of colleges and universities in the US that literally, in some cases, need to buy students. They need to offer them discounts to get them in the door. And they do this through something called merit aid, where they are giving out they call it merit aid, but at the end of the day, it's a discount off of tuition. And they use that to lure you in. Now, this has nothing to do with the quality of education. There's actually really good education at both places. And sometimes schools like an Emory and a Tulane is a buyer and Emory is a seller. They're very similar academically, but one gives out a lot more money. Tulane is a buyer, and it gives out a lot more money in merit-based or discounts, where Emory doesn't because they don't have to. And so I think this is a clear distinction for students and for students to remember as they're applying, because I think sometimes students are so enamored with the name brands and with the rankings, they apply to all these top schools, and then they don't get enough money to help them pay for it. Whereas the buyers do give out more discounts.
Excellent. For more information about buyers and sellers, definitely go to Jeff's website and definitely read his book, because he goes into a lot more detail. And it is something really irrelevant. I think we hear a lot about merit aid and don't have a full understanding of that. And so I do encourage people to keep going there. And if you do have more questions related, definitely ask them in the Q&A box so that we can continue to talk about this. But let's, so I wanted to go back to thinking about, because most of the students and families and counselors on this call are international applicants. Yep. And while your book is very focused on domestic admissions, I think there are a lot of insights that can be relevant and understood for the international population. So first of all, things have changed since 2018, 19, a lot. And so if you were to go research the book now, and you were sitting in these same three offices, what do you think, what do you think would look different? Yep. You started mentioning it when you talked about the risk, and people not wanting to take as big of a risk, but maybe some other things like how do you think those conversations would change, but also what wouldn't change? What would be exactly the same?
Well, I think the review process is not going to change, right? And many of the things they're reviewing still exist in the application, but there are a couple of missing pieces. A big one is test scores. Most colleges and universities have gone test optional this year and now next year. And for a quarter to half to 3/4 of their applicant pool, they're not coming with test scores. And so most of these schools, these three schools that I was at, require test scores the year I was there. So how are they looking at the application? What are they talking about in terms of the high school transcript, the grades and courses these students took? That's going to be a much bigger part of the conversation than it would have been 2 years ago. That's number one. Number two, the recommendations. If most of the school year was online and remote, how rich are the recommendations going to be? How much detail are they going to have? And are you going to have to try to figure things out as an admissions officer without that information? So that's second. And then third are all the other things that students do. They might travel, they might work, they might participate in different activities in school. But again, the pandemic has interrupted a lot of that. So you have to try to get a sense of, okay, students were doing this before the pandemic, or they were on this track before the pandemic. And you kind of have to imagine what they would have done if not for the pandemic. So I think that's the third conversation you would be hearing today. But I think the biggest conversation is, without a test score, how confident can we be of this student's academic qualifications, particularly when compared to a student who does have a test score at these test optional colleges?
Yeah. So let's say I'm a counselor, talking to a parent in China, let's say,
Yep.
Who it's a very test-based culture. I mean, we've been taking tests since childhood. And let's say the parents just like, I don't, what does test optional mean? And I don't believe that it's actually like that. People don't actually look at these, what would you say to them?
Well, I get it. The testing culture is pretty similar in the US, because I think one of the things about testing is that no matter where you take a test in the world, a number means a number, where everything else is in the local context, right? It's hard to compare high schools. It's hard to compare, the rigor of a course of a curriculum in different countries and things like that. But a test score is kind of a known quantity. So even here in the US, I think parents and students loved the test sometimes more than admissions officers did. I also get, though, why people are kind of distrustful of test optional. Before the pandemic, there were 1,000+ colleges that were test optional, many non-selective, but a few selective. But even in a normal year before the pandemic, most students submitted scores even to test optional schools. So the difference this year is that a large proportion of the applicant pool is coming without test scores. As a result, you kind of have to trust this, because you can't they can't enroll a class by only looking at a portion of their applicant pool. In the past, they could have ignored those test optional kids if they wanted to, but now you can't, because there are so many of them. And in some ways, the rest of their application is really strong. So my advice on test optional always is, if the test score if you think of the application as a bunch of signals of your strength, and they're sending all these signals to the person reading the application. If the test score is strong, or you're going to get a strong test score, then submit it, do it, right? Focus on it. But if it isn't, if you don't think it's going to help that application, because every piece of that application should move you further and further towards the finish line, if it's not going to add anything, then that's where test optional does make sense.
Yeah, got it. Well, so I mean, we know that lots of schools were test optional before. We know many of them are now saying for the next 3 years, we are going to be. Let's talk longer term. What's the longer term impact of all of this?
I think it could be significant, to be honest with you. We now have a second year of the Ivy League, for example, going test optional, most of the Ivy League at least, but I think there will be all the Ivy League pretty soon. And that's significant. 2 years without test scores, or without requiring test scores. You see today, for example, here in the US, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, a well-known STEM school, going test blind, meaning they're not even going to look at test scores even if you send them. So what I think is going to happen is, I think some schools will bring testing back as a requirement, but I think it's going to be a lot fewer than went test optional a year ago. I think you're going to see a lot more test optional schools. And I think test blind will actually take off at some schools, including some selective schools. So I think, unfortunately, there's going to be less clarity when this is all over, because a student could be applying to a school that requires test scores, a school that's test blind, and a school that is test optional. And to me, that is really confusing if you're an applicant. And you're going to have to make decisions based on whether you apply to those schools, whether you take the test. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of organization to it.
I mean, for countries like China, Korea, like things are looking a little bit better COVID-wise. And so there are tests. Some of those places continue to have tests. And so, do you have some, obviously every student is different, but who should take the test?
Well, I think if you could take the test safely, if you know from practice tests and from your own background and how you take tests, a test score is not going to, a low test score will hurt you in the application process, and a high test score will help you. So I think the biggest question is when you're looking at a school and they advertise, their middle 50%, right? So test scores are divided into, the top 25%, the middle 50%, and the bottom 25%. If you have a test score in that top 25%, that's great, right? Submit it. It probably will help you. If you have a test score in the middle 50%, I think it depends on the rest of your application. If you think, you've taken a really rigorous set of courses, you've gotten really good grades, you've done a lot of other stuff that makes your application strong, and your test score is, let's say, below average, you may not want to submit it. If it is, at the upper end of that 50% range, then that's probably where you want to submit it. So I would only submit it if you think it is either going to help you or that it is considered a strong score for that institution.
And you talk about this 50% number. Where do people find this? Because I think people are like, what is a high test score?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So most of the rankings put those test bands in there. But the other thing is there's a document called the Common Data Set. The easiest thing to do is Google Common Data Set and or search for, I should say. Sorry, Common Data Set and the name of the school. And this document will pop up, and there's a treasure trove of information in it. And as a result, you could, one of the things in there is this middle 50% range of SAT scores. So you could get a better sense of what the scores are at that particular school. Also, by the way, if you look on the school's website, most of the time they're advertising at least their average SAT score. So this is also something that you can look at.
Got it. Great. Well, so let's say I'm just going to throw out a few scenarios. One is I'm a pretty good student, a pretty good international student, and I'm at a school that is relatively well known by U.S. colleges. Our school has a bit of a track record, and I have an okay grade point average, okay GPA. So. And I don't want to submit my test scores. So other than, I'm going to put a plug in, other than doing the initial view interview, what would be your recommendation in terms of giving, that transparent information to admissions offices for them to make a better decision?
I think you're probably going to be helped by the initial view interview. I think you're also going to be helped by the fact that they know your school. Right, you're going to be helped by those two factors. So those are 2 plus factors. The rest of but the more that you could get into your application about why a test score is not missing. You don't actually say that I didn't take the test or I didn't want to submit a score because it was too low or whatever. I think the more that you could submit in your application that shows that not only are you a serious student, but that you've worked hard in school, that you've done all these other activities. Like it really then requires you to press a little bit harder on all those other pieces to show them why they should take a chance on you in the absence of a test score.
Okay, so let's say I'm not from a well-known school. I mean, I'm in an international space. It's a new international school. We had our first class of seniors last year. So I'm not a well-known school. Given what you said earlier about, admissions offices not wanting to take risks, how can I stand out?
Without taking the test?
Without taking the test.
Yeah, I mean, I will be honest with you. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough this year. So that is where I would encourage students to take the test. And if you didn't have, quote unquote, a high enough score, you might want to rethink your list of colleges. Unfortunately, that's what you're going to have to do, because I think that it's going to be difficult to separate you out from what might be other very strong international applicants. Some of whom, by the way, are coming with scores and good scores. And again, if they have a score, or if they know the school well, or there's other things in the application that really show an interesting student who has worked hard, those applications are going to rise to the top as compared to this applicant.
For counselors of these new schools, what's something that they can do to kind of get admissions officers more comfortable with students from their
school? I think it's a good question. I think the more that they could reach out and get to know the admissions officers, obviously, pre-COVID, you could, there was a lot more travel and people saw each other a little bit more, even internationally. Obviously, that's going to come back. But in the meantime, the more that you could tell the college or university about the rigor of your curriculum, what your school's about, what it does, the more of that, remember that context I was talking about earlier, that middle context, home and school, right? The more that you could tell them that these students are prepared, because that's really what, especially these selective colleges want to know. Is the student prepared to do the work here? Yeah. The more that you as a counselor could talk about that, and especially if you have the experience of other schools or other contexts that they might be familiar with, you can say, the curriculum at this school or whatever is as good as X, what I used to be in. That would be helpful.
Great. Can you touch on, when you were in these admissions offices, this notion of understanding a high school? What did you see in terms of how they understood the high school? Did they refer to high school profiles? Did they, how did you, were you able to observe that?
Yeah, most of the time, in some cases, they actually knew the counselors in high schools and they would refer to them by name. They have visited the high schools on a regular basis, sometimes every year. So there's a lot they know about the high school. They could describe the building. They could describe a lot of different things. But most of the time, they would use the high school profile, which is a document that comes along with the application that describes everything about the high school. Everything from grading to where students in the past have gone to college. It just provides that context. And they would read that very closely. So I always encourage counselors, spend some time on that. And then, counselors would call them, would call these admissions officers, talk about individual applicants, or they would just talk about the school, changes the school has made. Maybe they've added courses that made it more rigorous, things like that. The more information, I always tell students and counselors the same thing. College admissions officers are only going to know what you tell them. They don't sit there. They don't have time to search and look and research about a particular school or a particular student. So if you want them to know something and not guess or assume, tell them somewhere. I mean, this is really important because everybody thinks, well, they'll just look it up. No, they won't look it up because they don't have time. Remember, They are reviewing tens of thousands of applications in a short amount of time. They're not going to stop what they're doing, even for the most interesting, best applicants, because they have 10 others of them right behind them.
Yeah.
They're not going to stop and do that.
Got it. Well, so, I mean, for the students who are at, well-known schools in their country, but they don't know if their school is a well-known school, in the US, are there ways that they can figure that out?
Are there ways, you mean the admissions officers can figure that out?
No, the student themselves, like if they're asking the question, well, how do I know if my high school is a well-known school? Is the default, like, just tell them as much as, because.
Yeah, I think the default's as much as you can. I think a lot of it is did your school send students to that college or university in the last couple of years? As if they've sent a couple of students to that college over the last couple of years, then it's probably pretty well known. But if it isn't, or they haven't, or you don't know, again, it's never a bad thing to include more information with your application rather than less. Particularly, this goes back to test scores, if it's going to show you in a good light. Don't, I keep telling students about test scores, right? If it's test optional, don't submit scores that are going to put you in a poor light, right? That are going to be low, right? Because it's also they're going to question your judgment. Why would you send these scores if you knew we were test optional? The same thing is true for every part of your application. Focus on the things you want them to know.
Yeah. So, I think there's a group of people who still have this notion that the admissions officer only has 5 to 10 minutes per app, or which means I should not send anything they didn't ask for. What is your, from your observation?
I don't think you want to it's true. They don't have, the average time might be 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, an early decision, it's a little bit more. But most of these colleges and universities, and by the way, that's probably something else that would have been different if I reviewed them this year, if I was in their offices this year, because they got so many more applicants this year. So they probably moved even faster than the year I was there. Don't overwhelm them with other stuff, but there's no reason, if you, again, feel like something will supplement something that's already in your application or something that they asked for, a portfolio of work, if you're an artist, if you're a videographer, whatever it might be, other things that just demonstrate your ability to do this work, include it. Will they look at it all the time? Not necessarily, but it doesn't hurt you if you feel like this is yet another thing that might push me over that finish line.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Great. So we have a lot of school counselors. We also have some independent counselors on this call. So, as a high school counselor, you want to reach out and get to know the admissions office. What do you have any thoughts on how independent education consultants can connect with college admissions offices, and is it helpful for a student for that to happen, to provide context
Right.
that might not be available?
I mean, there is, I will tell you, there's a pushback now in admissions offices, particularly selective admissions offices, to these counselor outreach calls. Sometimes, if an independent counselor or a high school counselor has a question, most admissions officers won't mind getting it. But there used to be more of a relationship. I will be honest with you, a relationship between high school counselors, even independent counselors, and college admissions officers. In the name of equity, so for example, one of the things I point out in the book that has changed at some schools is right now around this time of year, when admissions decisions are being finalized, college admissions officers would get on the phone with some of those high schools they're really familiar with. They call them counselor calls, and they would call up the counselor and they would say, here's what we're thinking, or here's what we've decided. It would be kind of a heads up. Those calls normally went to only a certain number of high schools. And in the era of more equity between applicants, it's seen now as unfair. Like, why should certain counselors get calls and not all of them? So a number of schools are pulling back on those things. Some of it's about time, but some of it is about, like, why should I call you ex-counselor or independent counselor and not somebody else? That said, I don't think there's anything wrong. And I think that many admissions officers want to talk about their process, want to talk about the strength of their school with high school counselors or independent counselors. What they don't want is to be lobbied, right? They want somebody telling them that you should take this student and here's why. Could you talk more about the context of that student? Could you talk more about the context of that student's high school? Sure. But it's the pressure that admissions officers definitely don't want to get in those schools, those calls, I'm sorry.
Yeah, understood. Well, great. Well, there are a couple questions that I'm wondering if I should fold into this. Let's talk a little bit about, there's a question about kind of individuality and voice. And we've kind of talked about context a lot and what a counselor can provide and knowing the high school. But let's talk a little bit about individuality and voice. Like, from what you saw, how much of that plays into, I don't obviously, well, and you could speak to this, I don't think there's a formula, but how did the individuality and voice weigh in compared to kind of the data pieces and kind of these institutional goals?
I think it plays in a lot at the not at the margins, but at what I would call, so I think of this as a race, right? Every applicant starts on the starting line. and the applications opened up and they move forward through the process, right? So they open up the transcript, the high school transcript, or the grades, maybe the test score. Students are continuing to move forward. If they have strong metrics, strong numbers, that gets them probably more than halfway there. But if they look up and down the line of this race, there's a lot of other students with them. And there's way more students than they need, the college or university needs at the finish line, right? And that's obviously the ultimate goal, to get to the finish line. So that's where the individuality really does make a difference, right? There are a lot of students academically, if you're just looking at the numbers, who can do the work and get in. And in fact, this is why, somebody always says, well, why doesn't a computer just do admissions, right? Why is AI going to take over admissions? Or why don't they just tell us the metrics and say everybody who has these metrics gets in? Well, if they did that, or if a computer did it, they would have way too many students admit it, particularly at these highly selective schools, because you're getting talented students from around the world. So that's where the individuality of the voice makes a difference, because when you're looking at this sea of numbers, when you're reading an application, and when everybody has a 1600 on the SAT, and when everybody, whatever those numbers are, when there's so many of them, that's where something that's different, something that is a really well done essay, a great recommendation, interesting activities, or other things outside the classroom. That's when those things really, when you're looking up and down that race line, that's when those things push you further ahead.
Yeah, got it. So how about curriculums? People are asking about curriculums and whether or not that would be helpful, if you're at a less well-known school, but you have, a very well-known curriculum like IBDP, for example. How does the curriculum play into the review process?
So obviously the curriculum, like an AP or an IB, is really well thought of because it's kind of known as a rigorous curriculum. What they're really looking for is if you had this available to you in terms of the selection of courses, and this goes back to the high school profile, or if they know the high school, they kind of know what was available. What did you as the student choose to take? This particularly, by the way, true in STEM. Right. So if you had the most rigorous math courses available to you and you kind of didn't take them all, or you were on course to take them all and then suddenly you stopped, that's going to raise questions. Why? Even if you didn't get, if you're a straight A student, got great grades and suddenly maybe you struggled with a course, they would rather see that than see you skip it altogether. Or take the easy way out. That's what they're really looking at in the curriculum. What's available, and especially at these selective schools, did you really push yourself as hard as you could have?
Yeah, and it does sound like, there are ways to explain kind of growth in whether it be your essay or interviews or, to explain maybe why a grade wasn't as strong as.
Right. Or and I don't want to say, like, going back to the example of why you didn't take a course. Now, maybe there was a very good reason you didn't take a course. And I think that might be true this year in remote learning and online learning. Maybe students said, I'm not really good at learning online. I decided to step back a little bit. Explain that. This goes back to, again, they don't know what they don't know. So tell them if something was important and they'll take that into consideration. So I'm not saying that all the time they're going to say, well, this person didn't take the hardest course available to them, so they're not accepted. They will accept students if there are certain circumstances that are explained either in the essay or the teacher or counselor recommendation.
Yeah. So from your observations, you went to 3 very different schools when you did this research. Was there one kind of consistent thing that happened in the 3 offices in terms of a part of an application that was consistently important at every school?
Yeah, I mean, really that curriculum in those grades over and over and over again. That was incredibly consistent because they know that, as they say, 4 years of high school matters more than 4 hours on a test. It is that performance over time. It is trends over time that really give you the sense of a student's mindset. Are they disciplined enough to just continue to push forward? Do they want to grow and learn new things? That's why interesting combinations, for example, in the transcript get them excited, right? They notice those things. So, for example, a student who's taking calculus is also taking a really interesting literature course or something like that, right? So they see that person is not just interested in the sciences or in math, but also has broader interests beyond those disciplines. That's when they look for grading trends, right? They want grades that are either on the upswing, are pretty consistent, but they definitely don't want this, right? They don't want a downward trend, and they don't want grades that are all over the place. Because again, they want regularity. They want that discipline to know that when the student shows up on campus, they're going to be able to do the work, stick it out there. They're going to stay here for 4 years, and they're going to graduate with that degree that's needed.
So if you're, again, we have a lot of international students who are at kind of schools that don't have that track record, and don't have maybe these well-known curriculums even. So is there, I think some of people are feeling like, does that mean we have no hope?
No.
And what, will not be, if you're a student and you're not able to show any kind of grades from these well-known curriculums, what should we do?
So I think this is where the recommendation, the written parts of the application matter a lot, the essay and the recommendations, right? Because the essay could tell you a lot about the student, their ability to write and communicate, but also their ability to tell you other things about their history or their story. This is also, though, where other pieces that come from the high school, the recommendations, are critically important to understanding that context. So yes, don't think you don't have a shot. But tell the institution, tell the school as much as you can in the essays and the recommendations as you possibly can.
Right. Well, this is maybe a hard question, but there are often people who ask, are there quotas, or only a certain number of students from this region, this school can get in? What was your observation on that? What is your, what do you think the trends are for that? And specifically, there are a lot of questions about international students, and whether or not there is there's still a welcoming, attitude.
Well, at these most selective colleges, they are internationalized, right? It is something that has been a big piece of their priorities. We were talking about that list of priorities earlier. It has been a big priority for most of these selective institutions for quite some time. So the answer to the question is it still welcoming? Yes, they really want a diverse student body, and that includes both domestic and international students. Quotas, they don't have quotas per se, but they do like balance, right? And they look at balance. So as I describe in the book, they go through this entire admissions process. And it's at the very end when they really look at that balance. Like, do we have, not everything's equal, but do we have a good proportion of men and women? Do we have a good proportion of international and domestic students? Internationally, do we have a good proportion from different countries that have typically sent us applications? Do we have a good proportion of English majors as opposed to engineering majors, right? Those are all it's what I call the balancing. They call it shaping a class at the very end. So they have all of these people in their acceptance bin, usually too many than they really need. And that's when they move people around to achieve the balance that they want. You could see that as quotas. I see that. I don't see that. They don't just say we want 100, students from China, and we want 100 students from, the UK or whatever it might be. They don't have hard numbers like that, but they do look for that balance, and they want some consistency from year to year. So you're not going to suddenly see big jumps in any of these numbers on a year to year basis.
Wonderful. Thank you for explaining where it fits in the process. I do think that people are like, are they reading and keeping in mind right then and there that they need, more female engineers?
Yeah, no, they're really keeping it. I mean, in the back of their mind, maybe, but for the most part, they're reading that application. Remember those three contexts that I was talking about earlier, right? It's that last context. How does this fit into the whole class that they're really reading at the very end, or they're really looking at the very end?
Okay, great. You do talk a little bit about this in your book, and we have been kind of dancing around it in terms of like rankings and, you know, selective versus non-selective, U.S. News and World Report. For international students, I think the question is like, how should international students search for universities? Like, how should they figure out what are buyers and sellers? What's a good place for them to start thinking about it? And particularly, I mean, given the amount of time that you've taken to talk about buyers and sellers, like what's a strategy for the international applicant who also is price sensitive, who is considering price when determining which school to attend?
Well, I think it's really important to know their financial aid policies for international students, which sometimes are different than domestic students. So know what kind of aid they give out to international students. Get a sense, the buyers and sellers, right? So the sellers give out mostly need-based aid. Do you need the money to come? And buyers give out more in, or a bigger proportion in, non-need-based aid or discounts or merit aid. It's usually based on some sort of grade and test score and things like that. But for the most part, it's a literal discount off the top. As I said, you could find out most of that information in the common data set. There's a line about institutional aid, and it shows the breakdown between need-based financial aid and non-need-based financial aid. But it's also a good question to ask: are your policies the same for domestic students and international students? So if cost and paying for college is important, make sure you know that before you start diving into applying to these schools. Because if you apply and get accepted and you can't afford it, it's not that it was a wasted effort, but you should know these things beforehand. In terms of like where to start, one of the things I think is that we're so enamored, we're so in love with the brand names. And so we look at the rankings and we think we have to apply only to those top 10 schools or the top 20 schools. One of the things I came to realize, not only in the year I spent inside the admissions process, but in the 20 years of covering higher education. And by the way, I worked at the U.S. News and World Report rankings back in the day, is that there is less difference between number 5 and number 25 and number 55 than we like to think. We like to think, oh my God, I'm not going to apply to number 30 because I want to get into number 15.
Right.
There's not that much of a difference between those schools. I mean, the differences are minuscule. And so what I would encourage students to do is look at a wider list. Is there a difference between 20 and 200? Sure. But most of you are going to be looking at a school within a particular range. And there's a lot of good schools in a particular range that you can actually get into. So what I would do is just widen your lens a little bit and think about other schools that might be out there for you.
Right. Have you heard anything? I know, again, a lot of your work is in the domestic space, and I'm glad to know that a lot of it translates to international.
Yeah.
But have you heard anything in terms of international students in certain majors, like whether or not, is it, should we avoid applying for certain majors given the current international situation?
No, I haven't. And I will say that I spent some time during this admissions process with admissions officers who read and focus on international applications. It just ended up not being a part of the book because a lot of things ended up not being part of the book. I ended up cutting.
It's time to write a second one.
Yeah, I ended up cutting about 4 chapters that I thought I was going to write from the book because it was just getting too long. And so a big piece of that was international, because I felt like there were a lot of similarities between how they review international applicants and domestic applicants. Obviously, there are some differences, but for the most part, it was a similar process. But no, I've been doing a lot of reporting and research since the book came out in September. mainly because I'm doing a paperback in this fall. And I wanted also to see how admissions is changing during COVID.
Yeah.
And from what I know, they are just as interested in international applicants across the board as they've always been. I mean, like anybody, they're worried, are they going to be able to get them in country? Are they going to have to start online? All those things. But for the most part, I have not seen a big difference in their strategy around international students.
Great. Wonderful. Well, we have just a few minutes left, and there are a lot of questions that weren't asked. But if you still have questions, go ahead and type them in, because I will be keeping track of these. A lot of these questions will be answered on some level throughout the Tuesday Talk series, which is great. A lot of admissions officers will be weighing in about, what's a good essay, what's a good recommendation letter type of thing. I just want to make sure, Jeff, was there any kind of parting words that you wanted to make sure to say to our international audience today about strategies, to
Yeah, and
consider?
I think the best strategy is it's going to be harder. I will tell you, whether you're a domestic applicant or an international applicant, it is getting harder to get into these highly, highly selective colleges more than ever before. So I know that we all want to go to the brand names that are recognized around the world. And by the way, I think there are more brand names recognized around the world than we give them credit for. But this year in particular, Harvard saw a 42% increase in its applications. UCLA saw a 28% increase in its applications, right? It's going to be even harder, especially in this test optional world, to get into some of these places. My advice is to look beyond that top 20, top 25. There are really good colleges that are out there that are still highly ranked, that give you a great education and that are easier to get into. Look to those as you're thinking about your college list.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to pull up my contact information and also your website so people can know where to get more information. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Whoops. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Let's see. All right, here we go.
There we go.
Can you all see that? Fantastic. So here's our contact information. And again, I know that there were a lot of questions that were not answered, but we will be consolidating these questions. We also, for those of you who want the Chinese language of the chat box, we will be saving that and having an opportunity for you to see that. And again, you can email me at any time. We will be having more talks every week for the next few months. Jeff, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning and taking time to spend time with us. And I think there are people who want to contact you. So is the best way through your
my website? Yep, through my website. There's a contact form on there. There's also other information about the book. The buyers and sellers list is on there. A discussion guide about the book is on there. So a lot of information about me, and also there's easy contact information there as well. My only advice is that I get a lot of emails from people who want very individualized advice about their own situation. I look at those, I try to answer some of them, but to be honest with you, they become too overwhelming since the book came out. And I'm not a counselor. I'm not an independent counselor. And so my suggestion is to go to an independent counselor or your high school counselor to get some of that very individualized advice that you can offer. But I could give more general advice and other things if you contact me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again. And thank you everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, same time. And in the meantime, 加油, as we say in China. It's a hard process, but I think a lot of people are around wanting to support you in that process. So thank you again, Jeff, and have a great day, great night, wherever you are.
All the best.
Thank you.